Okay, so good morning, and thank you everybody for choosing to come early this morning for our opening session. I would like to really thank the library for choosing this topic as the topic for this year. And this is not a trivial decision for an Israeli institution to look at migration, borders, and identity from a global and a local perspective. Speaking about migration, border, and identity within Israel, within the Jewish world, is something that we speak a lot about. But opening it up and looking both at Jewish migration and non-Jewish migration in Israel and in an international and a global perspective is not very common. And I really congratulate the library for choosing this topic. Yesterday, at our opening session, Professor Halbertal raised the normative questions about migration, focusing on the topic of justice, setting our conceptual and theoretical boundaries for our discussion. Today, in this opening session, I think we're going to go beyond the theoretical boundaries, the normative questions, and go down to earth. And I hope that this down-to-earth opening panel will let us really know a more broad perspective on what are we speaking about. When we are talking about migration, what are we talking about? Are we only talking about routes of migration, destiny, numbers, challenges, or is our mission much broader in 2019? What are the main questions that we should look at? Are we going to speak about where are the migrants coming from? How are they migrating? What are the reasons, the big WH questions? When? Are we going to just look at a historical perspective or really put our hands deep into the mud and go into very contested and challenging issues that we have today? Are we going to look and ask some gender questions, the changing composition of migration of the 21st century? But I think that when we look at the WH questions and we try to go beyond the trivial issues, then we also want to ask, and it was raised yesterday, what happens to those left behind? Or a larger question, what is our responsibility for those who are migrating and for those who are left behind? Another WH question that we should go deep into is why is the issue of migration on the global agenda in the past 4 years when we know that number-wise within the African continent, within the Asian continent, millions and millions and millions, 10 times more than the number of asylum seekers and migrants in Europe, and people don't speak about it. Hundreds of millions of refugees and IDPs are at the moment when we are speaking within the African continent, and that's usually not on the world's agenda. Why are we speaking about it now? Mainly because most of these non-white migrants, non-Christian migrants, have arrived into white European Europe. So the what and the why and the who, which again was raised yesterday. Who do we want as migrants within our nations, and who don't we want? So all these are central questions to our issue, and we need to address them. Now, when I say that this has become the topic on the international agenda and on the national agenda of most countries, and I've decided just to bring few of the world leaders who are dealing in a very, very different mode of dealing with the issues of migration. And yesterday we were illuminated by some remarks on the Trumpism and the Brexit on two poles. But obviously Angela Merkel has raised, but also within the Israeli context, the issue of non-Jewish migration is a main and contested issue in the past 25 years. Why are we, when we listen to our politicians, listen to a debate which is a very dichotomous debate? It's either good or bad. The migrants are either for or against, and the gray areas and the more complex issues are left only for academic conferences, and it's not really debated in most of the national and international discourses. Another issue, which I think is extremely important, is the way that migrants, and more specifically asylum seekers and refugees, are depicted in the media. Very often, we see a presentation of weak, desperate, objectifying the people, treating them as objects rather than subjects of their own destiny. So why are we just seeing these images and we're not really aware, or some of us are not really aware, of the opportunities, the challenges, the positive way of looking at migration, the benefit that the receiving countries gain from accepting migrants, the communities left behind, and the way remittances build communities around the world. And maybe one of the most interesting and challenging concepts that I think we should address is diversity as an asset. Diversity as an economic, a political, a social asset. And that is missing from our global discussion about migration, and we tend to look at it, as I said before, as a dichotomic discussion. So in our opening panel today, which was titled Migration, a Situation Report, we're going to have 4 distinct speakers. And when we were planning the session, we tried to both create differences between the speakers and also some kind of a logic development of our discussion today. So we will start with Ambassador Eva Borje, a senior policy advisor from the International Organization of Migration, trying really to give an overview of the global phenomena, global trends, policies, and challenges. We're going to go to Dr. Dilip Ratha, a lead economist from the World Bank, who's going to look at the SDG, and that would be the lens of examining migration challenges and trying to look into the future, followed by Professor Saskia Sassen, a sociologist from Columbia University, who will try and show us or illuminate the emerging third migrant subject, which I think is going to be truly a challenging mission in the limited time. And finally, Professor Alex Alenkoff from the New School in New York, speaking about forced migration, and here again, going back into numbers. So as you can see, we're going to open and end with specific group of people, and I think that that was one of the ending remarks of Professor Halbertal yesterday. Who are we speaking about, and how can we differentiate between the different groups of people? And finally, I think that there's rarely a time, at least for me, when an intellectual manages to catch in so few words such a huge dilemma. And the words of Thomas Friedman about migration, when he said, "We need a high wall with a big gate." And I think this would be the framing phrase for our opening session today. So without further ado, I would like to invite Eva to open, please.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. I would like to start by thanking the National Library of Israel for inviting me to speak here. It's my first time ever in Israel and in Jerusalem, so thank you for bringing me here. I've been asked to start out by delivering a situation report of some sort, including some key migration issues, some definitions and numbers, why do people move, future trends, and so on. And I have 12 minutes and I can speak about this subject much longer, I assure you, so I'll try to do my best to keep it down. Migration has been my professional focus and favorite topic for about 25 years. When I've been working as a policymaker, not an academic, I'm one of the few, I think, in this congregation, and a Swedish diplomat from the beginning. The reason I've been so attached to this subject is that it really always takes new shapes. There are new situations, new events, new knowledge that comes about, and it's in the same time very technical, legal, and very political. It has social, economic, and human rights aspects, and it's really truly complex, and also really truly, I don't like microphones, that's why anyways, it's a really truly global and multilateral issue, and very exciting. So immigration and immigration provides states, societies, and migrants with tremendous opportunities. At the same time, there are also related challenges tied to integration, social cohesion, labor, and border management. And in addition to that, migration is a topic where potentially helpful information and data remain fragmented and often under-analyzed. The United Nations has estimated that as of 2017, there were 258 million international migrants globally, equal to about 3.4% of the world's population, compared with 155 million as of 2000 in, and that was 2.8% of the population. So there is an increase in migration. Most international migrants move for work. About 150 million migrant workers were existing globally in 2015, and even more recent numbers now show that it's about 164 million. Most migration occurs in a safe and regular manner and contributes positively to the host communities, the countries of origin, as well as to the migrants themselves. So why do people move? One obvious reason, of course, for people to move is conflict and the lack of security. In 2018, more people were uprooted by war, violence, and persecution than at any time before during the United Nations' 7-decade history. The number of people seeking safety across international borders as refugees were around 25 million. A rise in violent extremism in many parts of the world, in combination with economic stagnation, food insecurity, and disease, have led to a greater level of overall displacement and migration, now at 68 million people, as we can see on the next slide. That is not, I think, on the, yeah, sorry, maybe you can show the first slide. I see it here, but I'm not, oh, so I'm doing it. Okay, here. So, yeah, this is the 258 million number, as you can see here. And then I have, how do I do that? Alex, do you know how to do that? I just press, I have had no instructions on this, so so here it is. Yeah, okay, thank you. So the bigger number you can see in slide 6 there, or box 6. Moving on, inequality and uneven development drive migration. The most popular migration corridors clearly lead from poorer to wealthier places, as most of the people that are migrating are doing so in the seek of better life. Not necessarily always from the south to the north, but also south migration is becoming an almost as big phenomenon. The effect of economic inequality are really far-reaching, and the person's ability to earn a decent living is overwhelmingly determined simply by the country where he or she lives. And a move can mean, the simple fact of moving can mean a very large increase in income. People, of course, seek food and shelter as well. They seek better education and health outcomes for their families and so on. There's also a demographic push and pull in migration, as global population growth remains on track to present challenges for many countries and regions which are likely to struggle with feeding, educating, housing, and providing employment opportunities for expanding number of peoples. But meanwhile, other countries and regions faced with rapid aging populations have a need to replace retired members of their workforce that can actively contribute to their economies. So, what is the definition of migrant or migration? This is a contested issue, and there is no agreed definition to the word migrant. The reason for this are manifold, of course. There are legal, political, and even institutional reasons for this trouble. Different scholars have tried different ways of explaining it. Different institutions that collect data have different definitions, and so on. But one can say that there are, broadly speaking, an inclusivist view of this, and another view that could be maybe called residualist. An inclusivist view or definition of what a migrant is could be said to be: migrants are people who have moved from their usual place of residence, regardless of their legal status and their motivation for moving. Refugees would in that case be a particular group of migrants, so counted in the big number of migrants. A more residual view would say migrants are people who have moved from their usual place of residence for any reason other than fleeing persecution. They are a diverse, residual category of people who are not refugees. Definitions matters, of course, as you know. It matters not least for the type of assistance and protection different individuals will be afforded, but also for if they will be admitted or not into a country. So, what will the future bring for the migration debate? The key factors influencing mobility and migration are constantly evolving in a context where global fundamentals like economic, peace, and security will have strong impacts on how dynamics and attitudes will evolve. It seems most likely, though, that the numbers and proportions of international migrants globally will continue to increase at a steady rate in line with the existing trends. Migration contains many forms of mobility, and many of the migration trends that can be seen now in the world will continue and accelerate, though most will remain intra-regional rather than intercontinental. There are many challenges and opportunities that can be addressed, and I know that my fellow panelists will speak about them going forward. But I would just like to mention a few and then maybe say something at the end about how we can tackle this. Demographics will continue to be a challenge to be managed that will affect migration policy. Large regions will need more people to their labor markets, and other regions, Africa especially, continents, will have a surplus, especially also of youth. Migration data, I mentioned that in the beginning, is one of the big challenges that we need for more evidence-based policy making that will more accurately address what needs to be done. Migration and security, the securitization of the migration debate is another very big challenge that we are seeing for instance, in Europe, linking migration and migrants to security risks, etc., contrary, I would say, to the evidence available. Migrants' rights and protection is one of the big challenges, obviously, and the need to make migration more safe, orderly, and regular, not least to avoid the many migrant deaths that occur. Last year, 2017, the International Organization for Migration, for which I work, by the way, recorded 6,000 deaths and disappearances. Of course, many of these deaths are not registered, but this is a minimum number. The last one that I really wanted to mention is migration, environment, and climate change, because that is, we know that environmental factors have always been a cause for migration, but it has not really clearly been conceptualized in policy making, and the solutions have yet to sort of be developed in a more coherent way. We know that both man-made and natural disasters and climate induced migration will be very important for the future. So finally, how do we tackle all of these challenges and make the best use of the potential benefits? So there are a couple of things that I think I would like to mention. First of all, the strengthened international cooperation on migration governance globally, regionally, of course nationally. There has been, for the last 10, 15 years, a recognition of the need for strengthened international cooperation. The United Nations last year the member states developed a global compact for migration, which is a sort of roadmap outlining what good migration policies could look like. It's a framework for cooperation, it's voluntary, recognizes states' sovereignty, but also state interdependence and the need to work together on that. And I'm happy to speak more about that if we have a question and answer session. But I also do think that we have to really realize that it's time for migration policy development version 2.0, that we have to take the evidence and the evaluation and see that migration policy has to be developed acknowledging the need for migration and the fact that migration will occur irregularly or regularly if there are demands on labor markets and people are continuing to aspire to better lives for themselves and for their families. And I think that is really a starting point that we need to develop more factually as well. So thank you for that.
Good morning again. It's an honor to be in this distinguished company, and I was looking for an opportunity to come to Jerusalem for a while. Finally, I'm so happy to be here. It's truly an experience, and it's a great setting for talking about a topic like migration, attached to that culture and identity. Thank you very much to the organizers for doing that in Jerusalem. I'm going to talk about migration and development, migration and sustainable development goals, because sustainable development goals sort of have come to symbolize our approach to development for next decade or so. So I'm going to talk about SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals through the migration lens, and migration through the development lens. I'll make 3 or 4 quick points and show you some data. To put things in context, there are 260 odd million migrants. If you do some gap filling to the numbers that UN Population Division had put out, which Eva cited, is 6 million more, 266 million. The true number is significantly larger than that. But let's say 260 million international migrants total. Out of that, refugees are about 26 million. The others, call it economic migrants, voluntary migrants. I don't know if any migration is voluntary, question mark. But that is about 240 million. And then we have people who are internally displaced, about 40 million. They compare with about 760 million internal rural-urban, urban-rural, urban-urban, rural-rural, internal migration. So no matter how you take it, cross-border migration is roughly around, forced migration is roughly around 8% of the total cross-border migration or internal migration, 8%. I wanted to say that because I wanted to highlight that migration happens voluntarily mostly, and if it is voluntarily happening, it must be, it ought to be incentive compatible, it must be welfare improving. Mostly migration benefits all. The future, we heard about it. Some statistics we put out about 2 years ago. If you take the demographic projections alone, there are 3 major drivers of economic voluntary migration: income gaps, demographic change, climate change. Income gaps, right now, it would take 118 years for the income gaps to come closer if we use current economic growth rates. That includes 7.5% growth rate in India and 8% growth rate in China, and significantly higher growth rates in Africa compared to the developed countries. Most of the migration is south-south. About 44% of migration is south-south. South-north is about less than 30%. Most of the refugees, by the way, are in, like somewhere around 85% of the refugees are in developing countries. We know that. So not including income gaps as a driver, just looking at demographic projections, 2.1 billion people more would have joined the workforce by 2050 compared to 2015. If you use the employment rates of 2015 and assume that that prevails until 2050, which is a questionable assumption, about 1.2 billion jobs would be created. That would leave 875 million people looking for jobs, able-bodied, looking for jobs and not finding jobs in their own countries, in Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia. There will be significant migration pressure. Even if you take 2030 numbers, which we have, we will be releasing that in 2 months' time. That also suggests a doubling or tripling of the migration pressure. It's not clear they would be able to cross that wall that doesn't have the Great Wall, that doesn't have the Great Door, but there will be that willingness to migrate. In other words, they will keep coming. They will keep coming. 1 million last year, we had Brexit. 3 million more, I don't know what would happen. 200 million more, something to think about. What it means is we need out-of-the-box solutions. It will not be business as usual. The band-aid solutions are not going to work. Now, to just highlight why we shouldn't be so scared of migration. Well, I don't have to persuade that in this company here, I believe. Migration benefits all. Migration benefits the migrants who, on average, experience income increases of 16-fold. Their literacy level increases, doubles. Their child mortality rate reduces by 16-fold. Migration benefits the migrants. Migration benefits receiving countries, destination countries, because it provides more labor, as well as more skills, as well as more entrepreneurship, as well as more money perhaps, as well as perhaps the benefit of diversity. Migration benefits sending countries, origin countries, mostly through remittances, which I will talk in a minute. But it also benefits through trade, investments, tourism, entrepreneurship, skills. There are 8 links. The final one is transforming values back home. We know that Mahatma Gandhi was a return migrant. There are also challenges to migration. Migrants face dangerous journeys. They face discrimination. They face xenophobia. They face bad working conditions. A couple of them are recognized in the SDGs. I'll talk about that. Native workers in destination countries may also face job competition. It's questionable. On the net, most people benefit, some people lose. And those people become the faces on the TV, and they change public perceptions and political outcomes. We need to take care of them. People in the origin countries sometimes might also suffer. Most important one is Dutch disease, which I won't talk about because I don't think that is correct. But it is true that when parents and children are left behind, they need to be taken care of. So in the Global Compact on Migration, we have addressed the migrants. We have forgotten about people who are impacted by migration in the destination countries and in the origin countries. And that is going to be the problem. That's why some countries are withdrawing already from the Global Compact on Migration. Remittances, benefits to developing countries. Remittances, the red line here, shows $528 billion as recorded remittance flows to low and middle income countries alone. $528 billion last year. That compares with foreign direct investment flowing to developing countries, about 541 billion. If you take China out, then you are talking about foreign direct investment flows of about 300 billion going to developing countries. Remittances are a lifeline to poor countries. In India, remittances are 80 billion. In China, 67 billion. In Egypt, 25 billion. About 5 times the size of revenue from Suez Canal in Egypt. There are smaller countries like Tonga, Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, Nepal, where remittances are more than a third of their national income. Remittances are a lifeline to many of these economies. And yet, there is an SDG indicator recognizing that sending money home to home countries from foreign countries costs very high. On average, the global cost of sending money on average to developing countries from the north to the south is about 7%. Sending money to Africa is usually in double-digit terms, 10%. You send $200, you pay $20 to money transfer companies. If you send money from south to south, remember, south-south migration is larger than south-north migration. 70% of migrants in sub-Saharan Africa are in sub-Saharan Africa, and yet sending money from Angola to Namibia might cost 22%. So this is a sustainable development goal. The idea is to reduce remittances costs to about 3% by 2030. In many corridors, remittance costs are free. I believe remittance costs should be negative. We can talk about that. What can we do? I think the best solution, other than the band-aid solutions like fixing money laundering regulation, exclusivity partnerships between post offices and money transfer companies, the best solution is to go out and create a non-profit remittance platform. That can do many, many things besides intermediating remittances at almost zero cost. The remittance platform could be leveraged for harnessing diaspora investments through diaspora bonds, a bit like Israel bonds. That size of that market is about $500 billion a year. Diaspora bonds potential can be $50, $60 billion additionally per year. Remittance platform could be used for promoting financial inclusion, microinsurance, sovereign credit ratings of countries like Israel, like Philippines, like Bangladesh, and money coming through remittances can be harnessed a bit like electricity is harnessed out of a hydropower project. The water is flowing, you put a turbine, you mobilize electricity. Same way, remittances are flowing. You could mobilize development financing, bond financing through future flow securitization of remittances and other diversified payment rights. And then there is the whole big technology, the financial technology, the mobile money, and the cryptocurrency. We can talk about that separately. Finally, the other sustainable development goal indicator related to the Sustainable Development Goal 10.7, promoting safe, orderly, regular migration, is the high cost of recruitment, reducing the high cost of recruitment. This particular chart shows a survey result conducted by the NOMAD, by the World Bank and ILO, showing how much these individual red dots, that's actually an individual who migrated from, not migrated, within quotes, went to work in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from Pakistan, each dot. And you can see on the left, some people have paid recruitment costs, all of it is illegal, to recruitment agents, equivalent to about 3 years of their expected earnings. It is common to see a Bangladeshi migrant paying $5,000 for a construction job in Dubai or Abu Dhabi that pays about $2,000 per year. And that person would have borrowed money to pay for that migration cost at interest rates of 50% or more. That is modern day slavery. This is the dark underbelly of every society, including perhaps Jerusalem, including Dubai, including Delhi, including Washington, DC, where I live. This sustainable development goal of reducing recruitment costs, it is a low-hanging fruit, and it can be done through cooperation. We can talk about that, specifically what can be done about it. But when you have legal channels, then the excess demand results in rent seeking, people paying rent to get to that coveted job because visas are limited in a foreign country. When there are no pathways, legal pathways to migrate, then people use smuggling routes, and smuggling costs are in similar range. Similar range when you talk about expected incomes or smuggling costs paid as a percentage of expected incomes. So it is not unheard of that Chinese and Indian migrants are paying $40,000, $50,000, $70,000 to migrate to Europe or to the United States. Migration is a great way to share prosperity between people, between places. Migration reduces poverty. I think it benefits all. Thank you.
I want to talk, in the little time that we are given here, I want to talk about something quite specific, which is the emergence of what we could think about as a third emergent type of migrant, one not recognized in law. We have two recognizable subjects, imperfectly, of course, measured, etc., the immigrant and the refugee. This third emergent subject, in many ways, is a captive of a combination of elements that renders her invisible. She is a refugee of certain modes of development that we keep on measuring as GDP per capita. And GDP per capita translates really into making a positive out of a whole variety of conditions that are actually not a positive in terms of growth, economic development, and sort of, let's say, equality or raising the poor to a better lifestyle. People like Stiglitz, Amartya Sen have for a decade, many of you probably are aware of this, worked at this question, how do we recognize that more and more migrants and refugees, it's a bit ambiguous, are actually victims of what gets measured as something good, GDP per capita growth. So we have now arrived at a point where we can really speak about this third emergent subject. Why? Because most land in the world is owned There are 150 plus corporations that are buying vast stretches of land all over. And there are about 30 governments that are buying land in all kinds of places. And a lot of these acquisitions are invisible. The Saudis have bought a good part of Bosnia. They came in and they told the poor Bosnian farmers, take this money, it's yours. You have to leave the country. And those Bosnian farmers who were poor, and this is just one example, there are many such examples, they were delighted. It actually worked out very well for them. The condition was that they had to leave the country. They were happy, they were poor, they were scrambling, so they could now retire to Spain or to whatever they, I don't have all the data on that. Now, when you begin to look at the migration question through the lens of the growing scarcity of land in this world, then you begin to, if you want, see this third emergent subject, which is not recognized in law and which is invisible to the eye of our existing law, because what gets measured is presented as a positive. There is growth, GDP per capita growth. So again, I want to come back to the struggle that distinguished economists and scholars like Amartya Sen and Stiglitz have had to put on the map, not to negate what is there already, but to add to the map of our understanding, so to speak, of what we call migration, these types of issues. Now, back to my third emergent subject. It's one kind of language. We academics sometimes overdo it a bit. I happen to love this image of a third emergent subject, not recognized in law, but I can fully accept if you don't find this particularly useful or interesting or whatever. So this is a migrant who has been expelled by the 28 companies that just get vast pieces of land all over to extract water. They are the big bottlers, the Coca-Colas and the Nestlés and I don't know what. They are the ones who have been displaced or their land has been poisoned by mining. Mining is a huge operation. I mean, we who live in cities forget that we need our globe, our planet, to extract the elements that allow us to live in cities. Cities are absolutely dependent on the rest of the planet, and the rest of the planet is shrinking. And out of that then comes this third migrant subject. How do we grant her a legal status, a status that can be recognized? This is not an easy matter, but we know, I think there is a growing recognition and certainly a consensus that the migrant and the refugee, yes, they are good subjects and they deserve law, but we need more than that. We need other types of law as well. Now, in some of the work that I've been doing both in Myanmar and in Central America, as you know, Central America is considered one of the most violent areas of the world. To me, these are two examples because they show a lack of recognition of key elements. So we're all familiar with the Rohingya, right, in Myanmar, right? And the whole focus has been on religion. Yes, religion matters. But when you have a few months after the military in Myanmar expelled 700,000 women, men, and children, that's an accomplishment. That's quite an army at work. In 3 months, that many people. Then to still invoke religion, I think is really a willful mal-recognition of what is actually going on. And when you then have data emerging that all of those villages which were burned down to the ground, footnote, in Myanmar, burned land belongs to the military. The military run the big economy. This is something very... But anyhow, back to the... When you see that all of that land is now fully used by all kinds of military operations, you stand back and you say, okay, yes, human rights violations, yes, refugees of whatever, but there's something else also going on. That something else, moreover, and I consider this a second sort of little aspect in there, is measured as a positive. It's GDP per capita growth. So that's one kind of issue. In the case of, in other words, what I'm trying to get at here is how difficult it is, in a way, to really understand what we are talking about when we talk about migration and the multiple different combinations of elements, and how often one element is something that is rarely mentioned in the migration literature, which are these modes of development, right? So in the second case, in Central America, the interesting point is what made that migration from Central America visible was children, underage children, who managed to cross from Central America, the whole of Mexico, and appeared at the borders of the United States. Now, there are many, many thousands, but we don't know how many got lost. Now, the explanation that the children gave was, when they were asked, why did you migrate? They said, la violencia, violence. And there was a truth in that. But violence doesn't fall from the sky ready-made. Violence is made. And so there, the failure again of the analysis and the literature has been not to look at where did the violence come from? How was it made that these children were willing to risk their lives? And we don't know, again, how many died on this trip. And so then you have a whole other world. Huge plantations, very modern, very much admired by certain sectors of the World Bank and criticized by other sectors of the World Bank who look at the little farmers, etc., and what's happening to their land. So this is a mode of development that is actually generating a switch, almost like a refugee situation for children. Why children? Because once the smallholders, the families, were expelled from their land, they go to the cities, and the cities in Central America are major zones of violence, of drug trading, etc. Very, very bad situation. So what we don't see is the extent to which those families, it started as families, were thrown off their land to modernize agriculture. Again, we are missing something when we don't bring that in. So I just want to leave you with these types of issues. I think they deserve a discussion, they deserve more research, etc., etc. Thank you.
Okay, really great honor to be here. I appreciate the invitation from the National Library of Israel, and great discussion last night, and I hope we'll have continued that. I want to go quickly through a set of slides and some facts, and then get to, I think, what the core issues are on forced migration, and some of these have already been said, so we can do it rather quickly. About 68 million people displaced because of violence and conflict. Another 20 million or so each year because of natural disasters and climate. Those numbers will go up. And development, this actually gets to a portion of what Saskia was just talking about, not quite as broad as she's defined the problem, but another 10, 15 million people a year, perhaps because of development projects, so these numbers are hard to measure. So these are fairly large numbers. From this perspective, from the perspective that Dilip gave you, a small portion of migrants overall, and actually a rather small portion of the world's population, and I'll come back to that in the end of my comments. Here's another graphic showing this, and the crucial thing here are the dark blue and the light blue. I'm not sure why everything is blue on this chart, but anyway, the most of the forced migrants in the world are in fact internally displaced people, about 40 million people. refugees, who are defined as people who cross an international border, are about a third of the forced migrants, about 25, 26 million, as Dilip said. So most displacement goes on within countries, and I'll come back to that as well. Here are the leading countries of refugees. In fact, the refugee problem it's a function of a rather small number of countries of the world: Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, Somalia, and Sudan and Congo, and then you get to a lot smaller. But 10 countries are more than half of the displaced people, refugees in the world. Here's where they go. As Dilip said, about 85% of refugees end up in the global south. So as much as we think of the problem of refugees coming to the global north, it's a very small percentage of the overall number, and I'll make this the major focus of my remarks in a moment. Here's a kind of nifty chart that shows you in the last year where people left. So 1 million people fleeing the continued violence in South Sudan mainly went to Sudan and Uganda. The Syrians continue to go to Turkey. Turkey is the largest hosting country in the world, with 3 million plus refugees. The city of Ankara alone has 500,000 Syrian refugees. The Myanmar to Bangladesh, as Saskia just mentioned, those are the Rohingya flows. So this is movement from countries that are falling apart to countries next door, to countries of first asylum. And then here, if you look at the number of refugees per 1,000 inhabitants, look at Lebanon. Lebanon's a country of 4 million people. It took in 1 million Syrian refugees. I think about my own country having a panic over taking several hundred Syrian refugees, the United States, 1 million refugees from Syria in Lebanon, Jordan about 700,000, Turkey, as I mentioned, 3 million. It's a much bigger country, so the number of refugees per 1,000 is smaller. But as you go down the list, except for Sweden, Ambassador, these are all countries in the global south, and also except for Malta, which has gotten a lot of the Mediterranean flow. As to IDPs, internally displaced people, Colombia has been the top of the list for a long time because of the violence in Colombia. We don't normally think of Colombia as a forced migration country, but over 6 million. Syria, obviously, Democratic Republic of Congo has been there as well, and you can see the other countries. These don't overlap entirely with the countries that refugees are from. In Venezuela is our most recent migration crisis, you might say. It's affected the region. Several million Venezuelans have become asylum seekers in neighboring countries. And although in the United States, the focus is on the Central Americans, the so-called Northern Triangle migrants coming by caravan from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, actually the largest number of asylum applications filed this year and last year in the United States are from Venezuelans. But they don't come by caravans. They fly into Miami on visitor visas and ask for asylum, and they don't become a problem for the U.S. government. Problem in quotes. Myanmar was mentioned. These are Rohingya fleeing, and this is over the last 20 or 30 years. You see the numbers of Rohingya who have been pushed out of Myanmar to neighboring countries. And then also the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is both has a large number of IDPs, a large number of refugees in Tanzania, Uganda, and elsewhere, and also has refugees from Rwanda and Burundi inside the country. So it's a country of flows both ways, many displaced people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Here are the current challenges that I really want to spend my last 6 minutes on talking about. I've said something about the numbers here. The problem, the crucial problem in refugee protection today is not the flow across the Mediterranean. It's not the Eritreans coming to Israel, and it's not the Central Americans coming to the US. It's the fact that most people don't get beyond countries of first asylum. The way our international refugee regime works now is that people are forced out and then they are locked in. They are locked into their countries of first asylum. And I call this problem the problem of the second exile. The first exile being when they're forced from their homes, and the second exile being in countries where they cannot get out. They can't go home because the violence hasn't stopped. in their home country. None of the major conflicts in the world are being resolved. They don't move forward because resettlement numbers are so low. In the United States, under President Obama in his last year, the US would have taken in 100,000 refugees. Now, under Trump in his second year, third year, will only take in 25,000 refugees. Canada will take in more than the US this year, so the resettlement numbers are very low. And then thirdly, they're not included in their countries of first asylum because those countries say, we have difficulty taking care of our own citizens. This is an international responsibility to care for refugees. So in most countries of the world, in violation of the Convention on Refugees, refugees are not permitted to work. Half the Syrian children are not in schools. They're denied medical care. So there's an exclusion in the hosting state as well. This is the state of the second exile. And so what we have are around the world what UNHCR, the refugee agency, calls protracted refugee situations. More than 2/3 of the world's refugees live in situations that go on for years. I think I spent 5 years at UNHCR recently, and I think one of the saddest facts I learned in a world of sad facts on refugees was the following, that in the Dadaab refugee camp in eastern Kenya, which is mainly Somali refugees, used to be the largest camp in the world, there were 10,000 children born in the camp to people who had been born in the camp. That is an intolerable situation. Most refugees don't live in camps. Only about 25% of refugees live in camps. But they live in this state of continued, protracted exiles where solutions are not current. So what do we do about this? I'll go very briefly through here some ideas here. Let me start in the middle. The first thing we need to do is make sure that people in these situations of extended exile have a right to rebuild their lives. Their convention rights need to be respected. The Convention on the Status of Refugees, written in 1951, was a human rights convention. It gives people the right to work, the right to an education, the right to protection of social welfare laws, the right to practice their religion, and the like. And these are routinely violated in every country in the world. Not all these rights, but many of these rights. And so refugees need to be given a chance to rebuild their lives, to move towards self-reliance. One of the main causes of the current state of second exile is the failure of the Convention on the Status of Refugees and the failure of the international community to create a global responsibility sharing system for refugees. This was left out of the convention because that wasn't the issue in the 50s. The issue was what to do with 1 million residual refugees in Western Europe. And the idea was give them rights, let them take care of themselves in their countries where they've already settled. So there wasn't this sense of a need for a global responsibility system, sharing system. We need one now, because otherwise people will be continued locked in these systems. So in the Syrian situation, 5 million Syrian refugees overwhelmingly staying in their countries next door, there has never been an international conference of leading states, of the UN, of development agencies that got together to say, we've got several million displaced people, what are we going to do about this? Who will take what share? How do we parcel people out? How do we take care of people in countries of first asylum and even make repatriation a possibility? If we had done that, we wouldn't have had the flow to Europe. We wouldn't have had the European crisis that brought Europe to its knees almost over refugees and problems in Germany, if there had been an orderly way to handle people. This had been done in the past with the Vietnamese boat people in the 1970s and 80s. There was an international conference, Comprehensive Plan of Action, that states of the world came together, handled the problem, solved the problem. More than 1 million refugees came to the US. Others went elsewhere, but we don't have that kind of system in place now. Lastly, I want to talk about here the opportunities from mobility, and this will strike people, I'm sure, as really quite a bizarre suggestion, but I think in 5 years this will be a reality if all goes well. I'm always optimistic and usually disappointed. The idea here is that we should let refugees travel where they can take care of themselves. And this was the idea behind what was originally known in the early 20th century as the Nansen Passport. Nansen was the first High Commissioner for Refugees. With the fall of the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, a lot of people were without documents, without identities. And Nansen gave them pieces of paper that became known as Nansen Passports that helped them move, didn't give them a right to enter other countries, but helped help them move to other places. And this was before we had a massive assistance program for refugees. And the understanding was people would travel where they could take care of themselves. Imagine a world now where refugees had the right to travel freely to other places. Rather than the situation of 1 million refugees coming to Europe as asylum seekers, they would come as refugees, recognized somewhere, now traveling as refugees. We're not going to get this globally. I understand all the reasons why this won't happen globally, but we can start regionally thinking about mobility rights for refugees in regional arrangements, which would get rid of the need for large assistance programs and development programs, because we would give refugees the ability, let's say in Somali refugees in the Horn of Africa, to move between Kenya and Ethiopia and Djibouti to find where they can both best pursue their lives. So, I'm out of time here, but I do at some point want to talk about the future and the problem of people moving because of climate. But I do want to pick up in my last seconds here the statement that was quoted by Tom Friedman, that we need a high wall with a big gate. I don't agree with that, at least as to forced migration. I think we need a global collective effort that makes high walls unnecessary, because we will manage migration and not fear migration. The overall numbers here are small. 25 million refugees in a population of 7 billion around the world. If they were allocated through some kind of global collective system, no country would notice the arrival of refugees, and we would stop this spontaneous arrival of asylum seekers, which has so troubled so many of the northern democracies. Thank you.
Looking at all the 4 presentations, I just want to maybe try and provide 5 analytical notes that are in a way a combination of what we heard, and then open the floor for questions. The first one is the issues of definitions. Okay, on the one hand, each and every one of the speakers started with definitions, but as Eva so correctly said, there's a huge debate and disagreement about the very basic need to define. So if you can't define, then what are we speaking about? And if everybody is included in one of the 2 common definitions, then then everybody can be included. And as Saskia so well said, she has offered a 3rd category in an attempt to really solve the issue of definition. So that would be the first analytical issue that came up. The second one, which is well connected, is the issue of data. If we don't have clear definitions, then who are we counting and who are we leaving out of the count? And also the issue of who is counting and why. Okay, that is also a very contested issue of collecting the data and presenting the data. The third point that I want to mention is probably the voice that was missing here, and that is the private stories. As a converted anthropologist, that was one thing that was missing here, the stories of the individuals, and the fact that migration, as one of the great African philosophers, Achille Mbembe, said that migration is a glocal issue. It's millions of locals who are telling a global story migrating around the world. And that was missing, actually, from our discussion. The fourth is the way that we are speaking about migration, and it's always migration and then fill in the blank space. So we were speaking about migration and demographies, migration and aging that was mentioned. That's a huge issue that was missing here, maybe because all of us are very young. And the issue of rights and justice that was mentioned yesterday, the issue of migration and climate change or environmental issue. One point which again is very prominent now is the issue of migration and security, or I would say, Eva, migration and criminalization of the refugee and the way that he or she are portrayed around the world. And finally, I think that the point that Dilip has so wonderfully raised, the issue of migration diaspora and tying it with remittances and bringing it, to the front stage. And for us as Jews and Israelis and Palestinians, the issue of diaspora is so central in our history and in our current events. And finally, the fifth analytical issue that was here is the need as scholars to speak about today, but really reflecting about the future without having a clue. What is the future holding for us? I mean, just think about it. How did we navigate, physically navigate around the world 3 years ago without Waze? Okay, we were all holding papers and navigating our way. And today, we, as free subjects around the world, navigate with these online maps. And refugees and asylum seekers get their information through the web, and that is something that wasn't raised here, and I think should be raised, the whole issue of migration and modern-day technologies, which is also an important issue. And last but not least, and this goes to what Alex said, I think that beyond the analysis and the analytical notes that were raised here, all of us dealing with migration have to be optimistic. Otherwise, we won't be doing, thinking, and reflecting about optimism. And with this point, I would like to open the floor for questions to our discussants. Please.
Okay. Question to Dilip Rata. Who stands to benefit from this extraordinary exploitation of migrants you have described? In other terms, who gets to lose money if the projects you project will be implemented? And it seems this is serious money. People don't give up money that easily. Whose toes are we treading on?
Okay, we will take Sergio.
I'd like to thank the panelists and suggest two questions for short reflections, maybe. One which is really philosophical and perhaps more related to yesterday's panel, but was not much time. But I think it's relevant in all of our discussions. At the center of much of these debates stands the state or international organizations. We might also think of putting the individual at the center. And so the question is to the more enlightened like us in this room. Do you think there is an inherent right to migrate? That is, as the Americans put it, the right of life, liberty, happiness, and mobility/migration. Yes or no? What do you think? The second question is that I think one more important topic which has been dealt partially is really the area of the cultural determinants of migration, including conflict, which is essentially related to ethno-religious differences and tensions and conflicts. And I think it cannot be eluded. And of course, it then fits into the next question of the creation of diasporas and transnational networks and mechanisms, and of course involving not only the first generation about which we have data, but also the second and maybe the third generation, which therefore expands enormously our topic.
Well, who benefits from the rent-seeking behavior? I mean, obviously the labor agents benefit, if that was the question. When it is remittance costs, we know who benefits. All the people who invest in those companies which are charging so high fees, they benefit. They don't even know about it. One of the things about the remittance fee part of it is that somewhere around 150 countries have exclusive partnership between their national post offices and one or the other leading money transfer company. So there is a sustainable development goal of reducing remittance costs, which means you want to reduce remittance costs. Then there is the post office, which belongs to the government, which takes a cut of the fee from the remittance company. That's a tax on poor people. So policy inconsistency right there. So a part of that goes to them. Rent seeking. I have seen in many countries that the regulators, meaning the secretary, former secretary of labor or something like that, who governs the recruitment agencies, goes on to become the chairman or president of the agency for recruitment agencies. Some of the largest buildings in some of the upcoming capitals of this world in poor countries are actually done by recruitment agents. This is a bad situation there. That's on the first question. The other questions are, oh, you want to go ahead? Please. Sorry, I didn't.
The inherent right to migrate, coming back to that point, I think yesterday the discussion was I thought very interesting and very productive. And one item, of course, that was in there was that we need to develop, law is not quite the word, but we need to develop new instruments that take us beyond this notion of interstate borders. And again, I'm not going to repeat what was said yesterday, but it was an excellent discussion that really opened up a space. And in there then also hangs the issue of rich migrants, poor migrants, to really move beyond this notion of simple nationality. That is a category that was important to shape parts of our modernity, and we could not have had the modernity we have without that kind of notion of states being responsible for infrastructure, health, etc. But today, we are, I think, in a partially at least new period where we don't need the state the way we needed it when we really began to build the infrastructures, that allowed us to function. Today it's more ambiguous. I really liked the discussion yesterday that suggested that there is something that we don't have now. We don't have a formalized notion, and we need that. And it opens up, it takes us a bit beyond interstate divisions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're fighting over the microphone here to get to respond. I just had a couple of reflections. Thank you for the questions that came to mind, and that is that you really put the finger exactly on the very sore point of the migration debate when you asked about the inherent right to migrate. Yes, there is the right to migrate. In fact, it's a human right to leave your own country, to travel out. And that has been, of course, as you can all remember, a question in some countries that did not allow their citizens to leave. But there is not the equivalent right to immigrate. And this is, of course, what causes all these difficulties in the debate about migration, and the reason for us to work more and more on the global level to create trust between countries, to try to manage migration better, to find solutions for people who want to leave but do not have an inherent right to immigrate to another country. Then I just wanted to very quickly also comment on the question of diaspora, and not as a driver for migration, cultural conflict, and what you mentioned, but rather this in relation to also this inherent right to leave a country. Yesterday, which I think we all felt was a very energizing and wonderful discussion, it was touched upon this possible obligation for people to stay behind in their countries and help develop the countries. And this is something that I think is also another important debate, the debate around brain drain. Is there a responsibility for the individual to do that. I mean, I would definitely argue that there is no such responsibility. All people should be free to leave and do whatever they want with their lives. But I think that is also another crux around this should I stay or should I go dilemma that migration policy.
I'll be very brief. Migration is an important personal liberty. Leaving aside the technical international human rights rules here, it's an important personal liberty, but it may run into other personal liberties, and so it's like other liberties, probably can be regulated in reasonable ways. That's how I'd approach that issue. There may be stronger rights on refugees, and I think this line was drawn yesterday. It's a very hard line to draw between forced and not forced and economic. But at some point we know someone is forced from their home, and often they're forced from their home because of torture, violations of human rights and the like. And clearly people have a right not to be subjected to the kinds of serious physical harms and other harms that would force them to leave their country. I think it gets harder when you get to issues of climate change. One other point though on the definition, if I could just, on your first point. The line between migrant and refugee is difficult. Yesterday, Jeremy Waldron mentioned that the convention definition is fairly narrow, requiring kind of targeted persecution, which is correct. In practice, we've moved beyond that. So the Syrian refugees, the 5 million Syrian refugees, were not targeted. They didn't have to show targeting or persecution in order to be recognized as refugees around the world. And most refugees in the world today do not demonstrate particular targeting or persecution unless they get to the courts in the global north where they have to demonstrate they're a refugee. But where they are in the global south, if they flee across the country from conflict or violence, they're recognized as refugees. The hard question will be when we get to people moving from climate change and other kinds of things that force them from their home. And the legal standards aren't there yet. For the future, we need to develop a set of legal norms that handle a movement where you can't point to a persecutor, but you can point to factors that make it utterly reasonable for someone to leave their home, and those need to be evolved over time.
Yes, thank you. My question is for Dilip Ratha, not for what you have said, but for one of the slides that you presented coming from the World Bank, which slightly the way one names things creates the categories in which then human beings evolve. And one of your slides said international migration stock. I won't make any references to the shtuk of the previous world, but I will make a reference to the fact that when one speaks about stock, it means supply and demand. And therefore, there are shells of human beings that are then to be carted about for international organizations. Would you be so kind as to explain to me how this terrible word got into the international migration studies, and then therefore for perhaps Professor Alyonnikov, how does one get out of it?
Thank you.
I would like to ask the panelists if they don't recognize inherent contradiction between the concept of a nation state, the right to to determination, and free immigration. I mean, so free immigration has to be put in context of the nation state. If you want to have a free immigration, you have to do away with the nation state.
Thank you. Adriana?
Yes, thank you all, the panelists, for the thought-provoking lectures. My question is to Professor Alyonnikov regarding this very strong image of the second exile to portray the situation of people that are non-deportable and yet non-accepted, or perhaps because of that they are not acceptable. And my question would be whether this is not the result, among others, of the increasing fragmentation of the label of refugees or asylum seekers, collective temporary protection, and so on. I mean, we have too many labels, and perhaps because of that, the possibility of providing meaningful asylum is getting further away. And regarding Saskia Sassen, very interesting presentation, I think that what you are raising, Saskia, is the question, when do we start, what is the beginning of migration, of the story of migration? And I think that it has, it's meaningful for referring to questions of justice that we addressed yesterday, and to the ethics of the politics of migration. Thank you very much.
That's a new question, and it's probably the pitfall of using the English language, but stock is, in this case, used as a sum of cumulated flows of people, because there is a difference between stock at a time and then the flow during a certain time period, like per year. So that's it. It is a purely statistical way of putting it, but maybe there are better ways to do it, and we should really consider this. I have this kind of issues with migration literature because I come from finance and economics, but it's not only me, a whole bunch of people, right? The literature has a lot of people using similar terminology. The word diaspora bonds, when I talk about it as a financial instrument, but often people will talk about the ties that diaspora brings to the home country, links, but actually that's also the bond. So you have that, you have many other similar terminology issue. I wanted to make one point about the nation state and right to migrate. I want to flip it and just ask the question, does it make sense to have national borders? I know I'll be thrown out very quickly, but think about it. The world as a whole, we have seen national borders change with changes in the geography, in the endowments, in the movement of rivers, desertification, and all that, climate change. And national borders probably have a certain amount of time for a while, but there is also the need to change. And I think in the last 50, 60 years, we have done well by recognizing the sanctity of national borders, but we have also done some damage. We can't just put those people out there. So let me put this again, this whole thing about the Great Wall with great doors. I would say there shouldn't be any walls, and if there are walls, there should be small walls in a vast expanse of the gates. And the reason for that is migration happens because of willingness to migrate and ability to migrate. Walls reduce ability to migrate, but walls also create willingness to migrate. Don't forget that if there is water, you build a bridge, over time there will be different levels, and that is what is happening. There is a unified labor market, unified economy, you build a wall, the two sides will diverge, and that creates the willingness to migrate. If there is no willingness, meaning no wall, there is no willingness to migrate, zero migration. If there is full border control, there is no ability to migrate, zero border control. In the middle, migration is positive. So as you build walls, migration must rise and then fall. Thank you.
Yeah, words matter. I'm not sure about stock, but typically migration flows, they're called floods. We're being inundated, we're being invaded, infiltrated. These words have real political valence and moral valence, and I think it's really important to pay attention to language and think about the language we use. On the issue of self-determination versus free immigration, I think it really puts the debate in the entirely wrong terms here. No one's against self-determination, no one's in favor of free immigration. The question is how you talk about a managed and responsible flow of migrants in the world. And I had 2 points on that. One, you have to start with Yupke's statement yesterday. The countries adopt migration controls primarily to preserve privilege. It is nasty business. Yes, there are other reasons, like self-preservation and demographic reasons and religious, there are maybe other reasons, but it's primarily to preserve privilege. So the justification is on a state to justify why they should maintain their privilege against the rest of the world. And now, there may be lots of good reasons why, and we can then make that discussion, but it's not, to me, self-determination versus immigration. The second point is, happily, Most people in the world do not want to move. I think Ruth Gavison's statement yesterday was quite incorrect about the millions of people who want to move, all the poor people wanting to move to rich states. That's not the world we live in. As Dilip showed, we have 250 million migrants out of 7 billion in the world. This number has stayed constant. The percentage has stayed constant for the last 20 years. Less than 5% of the world's population are migrants. Now, if you removed all restrictions, maybe that number would go up somewhat. But it's not 30, 40, 50, 60% of the world's population dying to go elsewhere. Why? Because most people want to be home, because they are self-determining people, because they live in a culture with a language and a religion and a society and friends and family where they basically want to be unless they think that those conditions then become intolerable to move. So we've got to lower the rhetoric here on, it seems to me, to really begin to get control of the issues.
Okay. The question of where does migration start? And again, I think it's very important, the point that he just made, that most people do not migrate. It is extraordinary how small a share of the population it is. Now we know that there might be, you know, many who want to migrate, but we never hear from them. That is absolutely true. But I think one very sort of drastic way of putting it is a question that I ask myself when I do research on the subject, which is, if migrations start in the boardrooms of corporations and the war rooms of governments, if I start with that question, what do I discover? I discover quite a bit. So, second point that reinforces that, when people say that poverty leads to migration, okay, in some cases indeed, but mostly not. It really is it's a point that needs to be made over and over. And so, third point, very quickly, we have now reached a point, we have a whole new phase, my third emergent migrant subject, which is that, I repeat myself, most land is now privately controlled by corporations, by governments, by mafias, etc., etc. We have a very dramatic beginning of a new period here. And we're going to have to develop new categories of analyses. The Bosnia story I told has sort of a cute ending. Those very poor farmers were very happy to be able to go somewhere in Spain or wherever and to have a lot of sun. But that is just one little story. The Rohingya is a very different version, right? So we are deeply unsettled. So I do want to come back to something that was mentioned yesterday, which is this notion by both the first and the last speaker got to that, I think, which is this notion that the boundaries, interstate boundaries, yes, of course they exist, yes, they can be reinforced, but there is something else that is also entering the picture and is unsettling the meaning. I know that I'm a bit abstract the way I speak, but I hope that I have you with me here. So it is, the borders are still there, but they are unsettled. They are not clearly settled entities. And we see this especially in the big corporate economy, not so much with migrants. But I think we also are seeing it with migrants, though it's more elusive, because we tend to focus on migrants as in search of a better life, poor, etc. I repeat, when I look at the migration story, I think that most of those migrations begin in the boardrooms of big corporations and in the war rooms of governments.
Wow. Eva, would you like to add something?
Thank you very much. And I just had a short reflection on the nation states versus free immigration. And I agree with Alex that that's maybe a question that is put in from a perspective that is not really helpful when we speak about where we're going, because clearly this is not a direction that anybody is really advocating for solutions. I'm more thinking about what is going on right now in the world, where countries have come together and started a debate, a discussion with each other, how they should strengthen their cooperation, both very much in the regional context about migration and how migration should be managed to be profitable, benefit I mean, more people, and especially the migrants, putting the migrants at the center, but also at the global level in the United Nations with this Global Compact on Safe, Orderly Migration, which is one way of implementing the Sustainable Development Goal 10.7 that Dilip spoke about earlier today, to facilitate safe, orderly, and regular migration, managing migration in a better, improved way, not in a totally new way, not by making migration free for all and so, but making migration work for all in a better way. And I think that that is maybe really a thought for the direction that we're going into. How should we modernize the thinking of migration policy by looking more at the evidence and evaluations that make us know a lot more about migration today. We know too little, we talked about that earlier, but we know enough to know that some of the things that we do are wrong and that they can be considerably improved. And one thing I think is, although as you have heard from us here, this definition issue is very muddled still, the thinking that Saskia is also introducing by a third way, I don't think it's necessarily a third type of refugee, but looking at migration maybe from the big group of migrants that are vulnerable in their migration. Vulnerable either because of their sex or disability or something like that, or the situation that they find themselves in. That is a big gap in the global regime, and that is something that we really need to work on, including for situations of climate change and so on. So if I could just give that as a continuation for the discussion later, that is one of the most important issues, I think, today.
Thank you. I just want to make that point again, that migration happens because of willingness to migrate and ability to migrate. We can build walls and borders and then stop the ability to migrate. We will never be successful to make it fully effective, but maybe we will spend a lot of money. And that way, if you build a wall that is fully effective, migration would be zero. But if you don't build the wall, there'll be no willingness to migrate, and migration will be zero, except that you would have saved that money. I would say that's where we should be going, create more opportunities, and in our policy thinking, we have not thought enough about the fact that if we build more opportunities to migrate, then the willingness to migrate would also go down. This is the point that Alex mentioned and Saskia mentioned. People don't want to migrate. They are rooted to where they are born. That's why we have people in the North Pole and people in the Sahara Desert as well, and people in my village where I come from. I really want to go back there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to end by going back to the remark about language and the construction of reality and the way that we understand reality. We're speaking in English and there is a Hebrew translation, and I'm dying to know what kinds of terms has the translator used while the discussion, and not that I'm doubting the professionality, but within the Hebrew language there is olim, which is a word designated totally for Jewish migrants who have come from all over the world to Israel. And there's no other word for using that. That is the only word we're using. However, within the Hebrew language, when we are speaking about non-Jewish migration, then the sky is the limit. We have migrant workers, we have foreign workers, we have economic infiltrators, and then we are coming to speak about refugees or asylum seekers. Then we have both these terms as mevakshei miklat or plitim, but we also, and that is a central term used in Hebrew, infiltrators, for those who cross the border between Egypt and Israel since 2006, trying to find refugee in this country. So at least for us within Israel, which was not in the discussion today, the whole issue of terminology is extremely complicated, political, ideological, and truly frames the entire debate about Jewish and non-Jewish migration. And finally, in our last minute, I think that what came up in the discussion is that we truly have and we truly still need multiple modalities of thought and multiple modalities of action, because there's probably no clear one path to tackle all these issues. So once again, thank you very much, all participants, and for the questions. And we hope for further discussions later. Thank you.